Hello, everyone. Welcome. I've got a special treat today. We are interviewing Dr. Donald Lehman, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of Food Sciences and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois. Dr. Lehman has been a leader in research about protein, nutrition, and athletic performance, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular health, and he has over 100 peer-reviewed publications. So really honored to have you with us today, Dr. Lehman.
My pleasure to join you. Look forward to having a chat.
Well, let's start out with kind of I'm sure you get asked all the time, but a pretty straightforward question of people, especially in the keto space, there's a lot of communities that will talk about lowering protein and upping fat, and we've always talked about prioritizing protein. So where do you stand on, what's the proper amount of protein for someone to get per day?
I think the research is pretty clear that 1.2 to 1.8 grams per kg, which is about 0.5 to 0.8 grams per pound, is the target range. So, people can side toward the lower end. One of the things we know is that the protein and exercise parts go together. What we're trying to do is protect muscle mass. If you're vigorously into exercise, and particularly resistance exercise, you can probably side lower on that number. If you're more sedentary, I would recommend being higher. Usually when we're talking with people, we specifically target 1.5 grams per kg, which is about 0.7 grams per pound.
Okay. Okay, great. So let's make it easy for everyone out there. If you're 150 pounds, that's about what, 105 grams of protein a day?
Exactly. So we find kind of a threshold at 100 grams of protein. If you get much below that, you lose a lot of the benefits of protein relative to muscle protection, and we can get into meal effects relative to that. But yeah, we typically target 100 to 130 grams per day for most just sort of normal adults. Obviously, you're a bodybuilder, athlete, you might go higher than that, but normal adults, 100 to 130 is what we target. And that, lower depending on body weight, higher, depending on, if you're a heavier person.
That's right around where we typically land too. So, and a lot of that comes from, watching a lot of your work. I mean, one of the first presentations I've seen of yours was, I don't know, 5-6 years ago of talking about leucine and the leucine threshold. And so for our audience, could you explain what that is and some of the work you did around that?
Yeah, I think the two things that really changed how we think about protein were back in the late 1990s, the Galveston group, Bob Wolf and others, forever we have known that as you get older, your rate of protein synthesis tends to go down. And what the Galveston group discovered was that you could give 15 grams of protein to a 25-year-old and they get a very robust protein synthesis response, but you give the same 15 grams to an adult, and they happen to be working with 60-year-olds at the time, you got no response at all. But what they then showed is if you doubled that amount at that meal up into the 30s, they got the same response as the younger people. And so what we realized was the efficiency was going down. And what my lab discovered was the actual regulation of that was an amino acid known as leucine. When you're young, your muscles and your protein turnover is heavily driven by hormones, insulin, growth hormone, IGF. When you stop growing, late 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, now it relates more to diet quality and physical activity. And what we discovered was the body learned to recognize diet quality with an amino acid known as leucine, which turns out to be directly a signal for starting protein synthesis in muscle. So we discovered that link of leucine to what we call initiation factors. And so leucine is kind of a dietary signal that the meal is healthy enough to trigger what turns out to be a very expensive process known as muscle protein synthesis. So that's kind of the background of it. Those two things came together, and we realized that while a younger adult can get along with lower protein because they're kind of driven by hormones, older adults, because of the decreasing efficiency, have to increase their protein amount to sort of keep up. And if you don't, you accelerate that age-related decline in muscle mass, and that's what we're trying to blunt.
And when you say get older, like what's about the age where that starts to shift?
The research isn't that refined. We know that from an aging standpoint, around 40, you can start picking up declines in bone health, bone mass, or decline in muscle mass. We personally feel that the transition occurs in your 30s. Up until 30, you sort of have the benefit of hormones are all on your side. And somewhere between 30 and 40, that shifts. Colleague and I, Doug Patton-Jones and I, did a number of studies with 35-year-olds, and we see the difference of meal effects in 35 age. So, somewhere between 30 and 40 is that honeymoon period that you need to be making diet changes.
This kind of reminds me or made me think of it's anecdotal, but it seems like a lot of people that go vegan and go really low protein with like a vegan lifestyle, maybe in their 20s and 30s, can do fairly well. But somebody in their 50s will see a pretty rapid decline. And is that the main reason you think?
I 100% agree with that. One of my colleagues, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and I talk about that frequently, that it's relatively easy to be vegetarian or vegan when you're 20 to 35. It's much more difficult to pull it off when you're 55 or 65. And frankly, most vegans will find that it doesn't work very well. They don't have the energy. They get sort of a brain fog. They just don't feel as good as they get older. So, it's something that we think a lot about in terms of protein quality and protein amounts. And I understand the sort of rationale for plant-based diets, but I think people need a lot of knowledge. They need a lot of food skills to pull that off.
And supplementing B12 and certain micronutrients.
Yeah, all the nutrients that go with animal proteins, all of the essential amino acids. We've been doing some modeling studies lately, and the average American is eating a little around 80 grams of protein per day, and 65% of it's coming from animal protein. We have shown with modeling that if you get below about 50% from animal protein, you can't meet your essential amino acid requirements with the current RDA. So you either have to go to supplements or you have to increase your total protein, which means you're increasing your total calories. So there's all of these trade-offs. And, I think there are vegetarians and vegans who are very sophisticated and know how to do that, but the average American has no clue about that. So we have to be really careful with guidelines that people can't follow.
Yeah, we've never tried to touch vegan, but we did have vegetarian meal plans in one of our cookbooks. And you have to really like eggs because we wanted to make sure we get enough protein, and we put like 12, 14 eggs a day in these meal plans.
Yeah. I mean, if you use eggs and dairy, you're better. If you go totally vegan, it's really hard to pull off. If you don't use any higher, more nutrient-dense protein sources, the calories catch up with you. I mean, beans, for example, have about a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio. So if you're actually after 100 grams of protein, that means by definition, you're going to have 400 grams of carbohydrates. There are just some real challenges with the nutrient density if you go totally vegan.
Yeah, I once did a calculation of broccoli and how much broccoli you need to get to a leucine threshold of like 2.5. Like 8 entire heads of broccoli.
Yeah, it comes in a truck. It doesn't come in a grocery bag. Yeah, broccoli obviously isn't a great protein source, but it's just something that we think a lot about, and we just published a paper on protein quality, and we've got a couple more coming. I think it's important to get a better knowledge base out for people. Plant-based concepts aren't straightforward.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of tangenting on that, a lot of people do that for longevity, right? And so I want to kind of dive in, if you don't mind, about mTOR and aging and longevity, and kind of Victor Longo, some of the work. For some reason it's becoming more popular. And could you just talk about longevity and how it relates to protein or doesn't?
Yeah. I mean, I think at the surface, one of the things to think about is, do people primarily die because of longevity, or they die because of a health issue? There are 300,000 people in the United States over 60 fall and break their hip per year, and 1/3 of those never leave the hospital.
Wow.
As we look at people over 60, muscle health is really a key to having a health span. And so, are we really looking at being a healthy, mobile, active 90-year-old, or are we looking to live to 102 and being frail and incapacitated? So I think lifespan, health span, if you look at the research is done with rodents in sterile cages with no stress, no medical problems, and they're allowed to eat whenever they want. If you look at rodents in sterile cages, they grossly overeat. They overeat by about 40%. So basically what we're looking at in those longevity studies is calorie restriction. And everybody knows obesity shortens lifespan, it shortens health span. And so protein restriction, calorie restriction, at the University of Illinois, we consider a 40% restriction to rodents to normalize them. So all of those longevity studies, one of the things to think about of rodents when they're left in a cage, they eat ad libitum, and they eat 24 hours a day. You can actually look in the stomach of a rodent in captivity, and in the middle of their sleeping period, they'll wake up and eat again. So they're 100% absorptive 24 hours a day. If you hear me talk about protein, for example, we always talk about discrete meals. The worst thing you'd ever want to do is eat lots of small meals, which tends to be what vegetarians do, because that continuously activates a lot of these processes. What we want to do is turn them on and turn them off. And I think that's the correct thing. The other aspect is a lot of that longevity stuff is based on epidemiology, which is just really crappy food data. You take one food record, ask somebody what they ate yesterday, and 25 years later, you see what they died from. The idea that that's associated with meat or protein is just nonsense. It's associated with calories. And those food records don't pick up calories well, and they definitely don't pick up carbohydrates.
Yeah, food frequency questionnaire, what did you eat the last year? Who can remember to any sort of accuracy what they ate this last
or I mean, basically they ask what you ate yesterday, and I don't know anybody who ate the same thing today and tomorrow and the next day. I mean, so it's just nonsense. And they say, well, we used a lot of people. That just means you have a lot of errors.
a lot of error bars. Yeah. Well, one thing I want to say too on that is, you talked about aging, and a lot of people, they fall and they don't get out of the hospital. I recently read a study that was really interesting on bone osteopenia, and they would supplement with calcium, and they watched protein intake, and it was interesting how much protein influenced the bone stability and regrowth. And it is actually eating below the RDA. Didn't matter how much calcium they gave; it didn't help with their bones. Yeah. If they got at the RDA, at the RDA, they stabilized. If they got above the RDA in protein, they actually regrew bone density.
Yeah. So I published some papers with Bob Heaney, who was a bone expert many years ago. And what people need to realize that bone is first and foremost a protein matrix. Yes. The calcium, it's not just like laying bricks on a building with calcium. Basically, you build a protein matrix and then you deposit calcium on it. Protein also increases calcium absorption from normally like 10 to 15% to up around 40%. So protein is a huge advantage to bone health, probably far more of an advantage than calcium supplements. And if you look at the studies here again, you can always detect the difference between the RDA 0.8 grams per kg and 1.2. Any type of bone study you want to do, whether it's recovering from a fracture or aging or whatever, 1.2 is far healthier for bone health than 0.8.
That's great, and like you said, for that longevity and preventing those falls, protein is huge for that. So let's shift gears a little bit and now go to the other end of the spectrum. And we're talking about low protein. Let's talk about higher protein. One of the things I've noticed in a couple of your talks, you mentioned when you talk about going over that 30 grams. So 30 grams is kind of, of complete protein is kind of your magic number where you want to get that or a bit more to make sure you're stimulating muscle protein synthesis, which is the process of building muscle, lean tissue. But what happens if you go over that? Let's say you get 50, 60, 70 grams of protein. I don't believe that protein's wasted. Could you explain what happens? I know in one of the talks you had, you mentioned that it's not going to build more muscle, but it'll go towards the liver and kidney health. And so how does that happen? Or what's the process there?
Yeah. Okay, so let's think about protein as two parts. One is the total amount of protein per day is important. So you and I were talking about 120 grams per day or something like that. Okay. And then what we also know is this leucine signal is important. And that becomes more important the older you get. We know that the leucine signal probably optimizes somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 grams at a meal. Okay. We did a lot of research, and Bob Wolf and others did a lot of research. 2.5, 2.7 would trigger it. We don't think that necessarily optimizes it. It might optimize at 3. We tend to always use 3.0 grams. Okay. To get to the minimum threshold, again, the protein quality matters. If you're using pure whey protein isolate, you can get to 2.5 grams of leucine with 23 grams of whey protein. It takes 33 of soy protein to do the same thing. And so we've kind of always settled on 30 grams of protein, assuming people have, as I said earlier, 65% animal protein in their diet, some plant protein. So 30 is a good target for most people. The protein synthesis in a young person is sort of linear. If they eat 5 grams of protein or 10 will have twice as much protein synthesis, 20, twice as much more. It's a linear response. In an adult, in muscle, it's an S-shaped curve. Basically, until you get above 2.5 grams of leucine, you get no effect in muscle. So it's not linear. So we know 30 is important. And then back to the fact that total protein is important. There's pretty good data that you can get additional muscle effects on up to 55 grams at a meal. But it's a decreasing effect. It's slowing down. You'll get this big burst at 30 grams, and then it kind of flattens out, but still. So if for example, you're an adult trying to do weight loss where calories are really important, you might want to stick around the 30, 35 gram range because calories are important to you. Or maybe a keto person or something like that who's concerned about protein and turning into glucose. But if you're a weight builder, an athlete who's trying to maximize muscle, you might very well want to have 55 or 60 grams. So that's kind of the curve. If you have more, where does it go? Basically, all protein in the body will get metabolized eventually to energy. All protein will stimulate protein synthesis, and the other organs will respond. So if I have a diet that has 60 grams of protein in it, and I change to a diet with 120, I'll have a bigger liver, a bigger kidney, and a bigger GI tract. A lot of things will enlarge relative to that higher availability of protein. So in the short run, if you went to higher protein, you will get some enlargement of those organs. That will plateau after a couple of weeks. If you're doing something like body composition with DEXA or bioimpedance, you would measure that and say, well, he gained lean body mass. People say, well, muscle, well, that really wasn't muscle. You have a bigger liver. But again, that will plateau. What we know is that as you get higher and higher in protein, the efficiency of use goes down. And people will say, well, you just oxidize all of it. But in an adult, you oxidize every gram of protein you eat, no matter what you eat, whether it's 60 grams or 200, you oxidize it all anyway. So that's not a very good argument.
So just to touch back on the liver and kidney, so they get larger. That doesn't mean unhealthy, right? Like inflamed, no. It's a lot bigger and stronger, right?
Yeah, it basically, a primary protein amount in the liver is the urea cycle, which is associated with getting rid of waste products, but particularly with nitrogen. Kidney relates to size of filtration. So, as you need to filter more, it gets larger. So both of those organs, and the gut relates to what it's exposed to. Fiber and protein will cause it also to get larger and thicker. So all of those are just natural responses, nothing unhealthy about it. In fact, increasing kidney size and filtration rate actually appears to be a very healthy thing.
Yeah, we've actually helped quite a few, stage 3 type kidney disease patients with prioritizing protein, cutting carbohydrates, and they go down to stage 1 or 2 or 1 and actually improve their kidney health with this.
That's awesome. That's an area I kind of peripherally follow. I'm not an expert, but there's definitely an ongoing debate with renal failure as to at what stage should you reduce. Obviously at total renal failure, you have to be concerned about that. Yeah. But to your point, at stage 1, 2, 3, if you decrease protein, you're going to shrink the size of your kidney and you're going to decrease filtration rate. So exactly. It's totally counterproductive. So that's a debate that I end up in frequently, and frankly, I'm not an expert at it. But I think decreasing protein before stage 4 is probably a mistake.
Yeah, definitely. We've seen that with clients. They do so much better with just cutting the carbohydrates down and total energy and losing weight and keeping protein at a more proper level, what I would call. And one of the things you mentioned too is people on a ketogenic diet that might want to worry about protein turning into glucose and those kind of things. For me personally, I've never understood that fear, just because gluconeogenesis, the process of turning protein into carbohydrate or into glucose, it's primarily demand driven, right? It's not going to just throw out, make your glucose go to 200 milligrams per deciliter because you ate a bunch of protein, right? It's primarily just if there's extreme excess, it's going to turn it into glucose, or if the body needs glucose, right? And if you look at it in that context, eating essentially low carb or zero carbohydrates, gluconeogenesis is what makes that possible, because there's still red blood cells, still right. Things that need glucose, right? Right.
And the important thing to think about with protein is the body handles glucose from protein very differently. When you eat a carbohydrate meal, the body has to get rid of it within 2 hours. So you can metabolize maybe 20 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So if the average American is eating 300 grams of carbs per day, that means they're getting nearly 100 grams per meal. That means you've got 60 grams at every meal that you can't dispose of very well. So you have to put it somewhere. So the problem with that is it gives you big glucose spikes. With protein after a meal, it takes 5 or 6 hours to metabolize the protein. So it's a very long, slow process. Protein is converted into glucose all the time. If you eat 100 grams of protein per day, you're going to get 60 grams of carbohydrates. I mean, glucose. That's just the metabolism. If you eat 200, you're going to get 120. It's a 60% conversion. But it's very slow, and it happens around the clock. So in the middle of the night, a person on a high carb diet will end up with a very low blood sugar. where a person on a high protein diet will end up with a very flat blood sugar. It'll stay very constant even in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and then on that too, so this 60 grams, I think I've seen some numbers of if you're essentially eating zero carbohydrate and doing it for extended periods and you've kind of depleted your body, your liver, the 60 grams a day is in the ballpark of what you need for daily glucose without as in a ketogenic state. Is that about right?
I think most of the estimates for brain, red blood cells, kidney that you mentioned are in the 70 to 80 gram per day range. And based on that, the Institute of Medicine or National Academy of Science actually established a carbohydrate RDA of 130. So it's basically 70 or 80 grams per day with 2 standard deviations above it. The way all RDAs are established, 130. So I think that 130 grams per day of carbohydrates, an important one to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I would guess that when they made that RDA, they're also thinking of people eating a standard type of diet. And I know that when you do eat ketogenically, the brain will get quite a bit of its fuel from ketones instead of glucose. So that might be a little bit of a difference there in those numbers.
Sure. I mean, there's certainly a trade-off. The brain is always a glucose user. It can use ketones. People back in, years back would say, well, the brain totally shifts to ketones. It doesn't do that. It still requires glucose, but it does go down. From a metabolic standpoint, we see a massive change in how the body handles body handles glycemic regulation when you get daily carbs below 140. So in terms of blood insulin, blood glucose, triglycerides, blood pressure, we see huge differences. And frankly, in most of our studies, we don't see too much of a difference when you go from 130 lower. We see about the same effect. So there's definitely a threshold for carbohydrate use. And when I think about 130, I think about breaking it up into meals. We find that if you keep a meal below about 30 grams of carbohydrate, generally insulin and glycemic regulation stays pretty stable. When you get above 50, now you're going to start challenging metabolism. And so there's that kind of threshold there, where you shift the metabolism to mandatory disposal as to sort of natural metabolism.
We are in the middle of the Tongass rainforest, the world's largest rainforest up here in Alaska, outside of Sitka, and it was one heck of a hike coming up here, but it's totally worth it for these views. A beautiful lake up here in the mountains. And one of the things I really love is that LMNT, you can pack it on the airplane, you can pack it with you when you're hiking, because I needed it coming up this hill, and it gives me the energy to get up here, especially when you're exerting yourself a lot in hiking, or if it's really hot out and you're sweating. You want to have your electrolytes on to make sure you stay hydrated and you don't get dehydrated and lose your energy. And of course, when you're starting out with keto, having the electrolytes with keto or carnivore is really important to keep you your energy up and keep your electrolytes where they need to be. So check it out at drinkelement.com/KetoMaria.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about aging a little bit more. I want to touch on the leucine curve, how it shifts with age, and you require more protein to trigger muscle synthesis. Is there any way to kind of quantify, or is there maybe just a rule of thumb that we could use that after 40, after 70, is there kind of a estimate 10 grams, 20 grams you should add to your total or something like that?
That's interesting. I've been getting that question more often, and I don't actually have. I don't think the research actually has an answer to that. We know that a 50-year-old is different than a 25-year-old, but do we know that a 40 is different than a 50 versus a 60 versus a 70? What we know for 100% sure is your calorie needs go down as you go from 40 to 70. And so where a 40-year-old may be able to get their 120 grams of protein with 2,500 calories, a 75-year-old probably has to get it in 1,600 calories. So what we know is that leucine requirement and that protein requirement, in my mind, stay about the same as you get older, but your calories go down. So that means your nutrient density, the quality of your diet needs to get progressively better. So I don't know of any data to suggest that, you know, at 40, you need 3 grams of leucine, and at 70, you need 6. I don't think that data exists. And I'm obviously pretty close to the leucine story.
Definitely. So if anything, as you age, you want to shift to leaner cuts of meats, you know, get more protein with less calories. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and your, you know, leaner cuts of protein, fine, but all of the other foods are the issue. You know, it's the breads and the French fries and the snack foods and everything else you have to be more and more careful with. You know, people forever thought that the solution to dairy was skim milk. We know for 100% sure that's not the road. We never recommend people go below 2% fat in milk because you lose a lot of the nutritional value, you lose a lot of the satiety. So, you know, blaming lean protein sources isn't really the issue. We dropped from 1990 to 2010, we dropped consumption of dairy, eggs, and beef by 35%, a third in each category, and fat intake didn't change at all. It's just that we substituted from other foods. So, you know, people get hung up on fat in the wrong place. What we always teach people is worry about non-protein foods. Let the fat that comes with the protein food be natural, but worry about the fat on your French fries or the fat you put on your toast or what you put on the top of your pizza. Those are the places.
There's some people that will put a stick of butter on the steak. Well, that's not needed.
Yeah. I mean, putting fat in dumb places makes no sense to me. You know, putting sticks of butter in your coffee has to be the dumbest thing I've ever heard of.
I'm with you 100% on that. So let's talk a little bit more about meal timing. So, you know, in this community too, there's a subset that talk about one meal a day and how they restrict and they do, you know, tighter eating windows and these kind of things. And we've always been against one meal a day because especially for women, it's really hard to get enough protein in one meal for the day. But there's more nuance to that too that I know you can explain much better than me about how you should break those up for for the total protein for the day. What should that look like, of course, over the course of the day in different meal timing?
Yeah. So again, you know, I think there are different answers to it as to your goal. You know, are you a perfectly healthy adult who's happy with their body weight and just trying to protect, you know, healthy aging? In that case, I think a time-restricted eating is perfectly fine. We know that time-restricted feeding tends to reduce calories for people. You know, as you get older, we were just talking that, you know, a 70-year-old female may only need 1,400 calories per day. If you dribble that out into lots of small meals, they're just nibbling. You know, there's no real protein content to it. So we know that there's this 35 gram target for protein. And so then how do you want to distribute that? And your point is one meal a day, 120 grams of protein. Most adults can't eat that. I don't think I could eat that. And so I think 2 meals a day is pretty functional. I personally like a concept of what I would call restricted eating. I like having 2 meals, but one of them early in the day and one of them late in the day. And the middle meal I don't do as much with. I try and really control my calories. I like to exercise in the middle of the day. That helps me not be hungry. So I kind of do it that way. If people want to restrict 2 meals a day, a time restricted eating, I've sort of gone to not referring to, I refer to the first meal of the day as the first meal as opposed to breakfast. I don't really care whether it happens at 7 or whether it happens at 11 a.m. You know, it's the first meal. When you're coming out of that overnight catabolic fast, I think that's important. However, a subset, if you're a person who's actively trying to lose weight, now you're in a catabolic state, you're breaking down tissue, fat, and muscle. Now I think you really ought to push that first meal early in the day. I think that we always use 3-meal distribution, one at around 7, a noon, and another around 6 or 7. So we want it distributed through the day. We don't want people hungry. We kind of front load the calories to the first meal. We want people to go through the day feeling satisfied, not hungry, not looking for snacks. So when you're in a catabolic state, so weight loss, any kind of a health issue, bed fast, bed rest, even just normal aging, a 70-year-old, I'd like that first meal to be as soon after waking up as possible.
That's great advice. You know, I think a lot of people that we coach, they tend to migrate to 2 meals, and like you said, maybe in the morning or afternoon and evening, and mostly because they've just, when you cut the carbohydrates down, you have more satiety, and you're just not as hungry as often. Have to eat as much, right? So I think that makes a lot of sense.
That's definitely my style. We find it works pretty well. One of the things that's confusing out there to people is when we published one of the first studies, we did a study where we actually did an even distribution during the day, and everybody's kind of latched onto that as it's all about an even distribution. No, it's actually about distributing it from the dinner meal, which had more than enough protein in it, to the first meal of the day. We happen to do it by doing it evenly, and I kind of wish we hadn't. When I personally have about 45 grams of protein at breakfast, I have about 20 at lunch, and I have 55 at dinner. And that's kind of my pattern to get to the sort of 120 range.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about that first meal, you know, getting enough leucine is kind of the trigger to the body to say, yep, today we're going to build muscle because today we're getting enough. So having that first meal is important with enough.
And
complete.
the people want to make leucine some sort of a hormone or something, and it's not. It's a recovery signal. And so the reality is the only meal that we really are confident that leucine makes any difference at is the first meal. We're not 100% sure that it makes any difference at dinner at all. Nobody's ever really tested it. So the only place it's ever really been tested is the first meal after an overnight fast or immediately after intense exercise. Again, both are catabolic periods, and what leucine does is a signal for recovery. What we know is after a high protein breakfast, 5 hours later, the leucine and the signals are all still active. So you go into lunch and the signals are all still active. Is leucine important or not? Well, the reality is we don't know. Nobody's ever actually measured it.
Well, that's interesting. It's an interesting point. So let's go into exercise then, because I know I heard you talk a lot about the importance of exercise, and it's as far as muscle building, it's maybe the 75% of the solution versus 25% being enough protein in the diet. So let's go into that a little further, because a lot of the people that we have are metabolically damaged. They have insulin resistance. They've got obesity, and they need to lose weight. And one of the ways that we promote is not only get enough protein, but strength train as well. And so can you talk about the relationship of the protein and strength train, how they work together?
So again, it depends on who you're talking about. So the 75-25 percentage that you've heard me refer to is for an athlete and muscle builder. Okay. So if you were trying to build muscle mass, the way you're going to do that is with resistance training, and you need heavier and heavier weights. Protein is a limiting factor. It's very hard to build muscle mass if you're only eating 50 grams of protein per day. But once you get into 150, you probably max that out. So there's this debate out there for a muscle builder, how much do you need? Is 1.5 grams per kg enough, or do you do 2.5 grams? A lot of muscle builders will go to 2.5. What we know is that once you get to about 1.5, going to 2.5 won't give you more muscle mass. It's about resistance exercise. So 75-25 is kind of related to that person. We did a study with adult women and weight loss where we did really the first protein and exercise study during weight loss. And what we showed was that the protein effect and the exercise effect were about equal. They're sort of additive, each about equal. Let me describe that experiment a little more because it's very useful. So we did what's called a 2x2 experiment. So we had a high carb, low protein diet. It was basically identical to the food guide pyramid. And then we had that same diet group with resistance exercise 3 days a week. We then had a high protein, low carb group, our typical diet, 120 grams of protein, carbs less than 130 grams per day, and 3 days, and then a group with exercise, 3 days a week. So with the high carb, low protein group, they lost weight, but of the weight they lost, 35% was lean body mass. When we added 3 days a week of resistance exercise onto that, only 25% of it was lean body mass. So the exercise spared some protein.
Yeah.
We then compared it to the high protein diet, and the high protein diet lost 25% protein. So the high protein diet people did exactly as good as the food guide pyramid with daily exercise, 3 days a week of resistance exercise.
Wow.
And then when we added exercise on top of that, we reduced the lean loss down to less than 6%.
Wow.
So they're additive as you go. Exercise is important in either group, but if you put protein and exercise together, you can pretty much blunt all muscle loss during weight loss.
Yeah, I was gonna say the 6% is what's the actual minimum of protein loss with fat loss?
We think it's around 3 or 4% because that's the lean tissue that would be associated with blood vessels and stuff and fat. So that would be the minimum. Some of it would be organ loss too. So if you can get it down to less than 10% loss of lean tissue during a weight loss, you're pretty much protecting your muscles.
That's great. Yeah, it really shows the importance of strength training, some resistance training on top of.
And that, sort of to cap that off, with the weightlifter, I mentioned heavier and heavier weights. In that diet study with the adult women, what we did was really focus on stretch. They had an initial 10-minute session with a trainer doing yoga, and then they had an 8-station Nautilus, and we had them go through the range of motion, but with no weights. So we recognize that adult women don't like to go to gyms and lift a lot of weight. And what we know is the first step in, quote, resistance training is stretch. So you can get a huge benefit from yoga and stretching and rubber bands and things like that without going to the gym and lifting heavy weights. Lifting heavy weights improves it, bigger benefit, but you never want to discount the fact that just getting up in the morning and doing a stretching routine has a huge benefit.
That's great. Yeah, that's very valuable because, I agree. A lot of women don't want to grab the dumbbells and, do that stuff and to get almost as much benefit on lean mass. That's with yoga. That's really great data.
Again, lifting weights will give you a bigger benefit, but you do get a huge benefit just by having consistent routine stretching and resistance. So again, people don't want to discount it because they don't like the look of barbells.
Well, one other thing I wanted to kind of touch on is, what we're just talking about, preserving lean mass while losing body fat. I think this is an important point because, there's some people that promote extended fasting for weight loss where you eat nothing for 2-3 days. And we haven't been a proponent of that because of the muscle loss with extended fasting. We think, especially as we get older, it's so important. I kind of think of the muscle I have today as like a down payment on my future vitality, right? My strength and vitality as I get older and do lose some muscle. But it's also a very important, I believe, for insulin resistance, regardless of age.
Exactly.
If you look at one of the things I'm a big proponent of is personal fat threshold, which is the concept of most people don't make substantially more new adipose cells, fat tissue, fat cells, as they get older. As when you're a toddler, you tend to make more fat cells. Most people don't make new fat cells as they get older. And it's been shown that, adipose tissue, when it gets overstuffed and inflamed, it becomes insulin resistant. And this can be a driver of insulin resistance when you have a lot of your fat cells are overstuffed and inflamed. So to reverse the insulin resistance, you want to shrink them. Smaller fat cells are happier fat cells. And so how do you shrink them? You lose body fat. And then maintaining muscle while you're doing that gives glucose more places to go. So instead of losing muscle with an extended fast, if you get enough protein to maintain your muscle, now you've got more places to shove glucose, and that can help with the insulin resistance as well. Is that something that you've seen in your experience too?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us think about muscle. We think about mobility and ability to do things physically. But to your point, metabolic health starts in muscle. Muscle is the primary place where we have flexibility in burning glucose, but also in fatty acids. The primary fuel of muscle is actually fatty acids. Until you get above 65% VO2 max, 65% of your maximum effort, muscle primary fuel is fat. The downside of that is if you bring in too much carbohydrate, it shuts down muscle's ability to burn fat. And so there's that countering thing that we're eating too many carbs and that's disrupting fat metabolism. And people say, well, it's blood fats that are causing all these problems. Well, blood fats probably do cause problems, but the cause of the blood fats is carbohydrates. So if you correct the carbohydrate problem, the fat problem corrects itself. So, muscle is definitely the key to that. Keeping your muscle healthy as you get older. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and I always talk about muscle-centric health. People think about heart disease and cancer and things like that. But the reality is if your muscles are healthy, all those other things tend to take care of themselves. The starting point is really muscle. If you can keep your muscles healthy, chances are those other things will have a pretty good chance of being normalized. And that's certainly, there's been a huge amount of research relative to metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes relative to that. If you keep your muscles healthy, you've got a real shot at the very least, reducing your medications and maybe totally normalizing yourself.
Absolutely. And that's our experience as well. And as you get older, again, harder to build muscle, more proteins required even to maintain your muscle. And if you do fasting and you're losing muscle, you're kind of shifting the metabolic state in the wrong direction as far as insulin resistance.
You mentioned fasting. Back in the 90s, there was a huge debate whether, with obesity showing up, whether people over 60 should ever try and lose weight because of the concern about muscle loss. Was the muscle loss a bigger risk than keeping the excess fat? Now what we know is that you can do both, is that you can keep the muscle with the right diet and exercise and lose the fat. So we've kind of transitioned about that, but there was a huge debate. I remember Steve Krzyzewski and others, who were doing a lot of aging work, they were actively debating whether a 65-year-old does more damage. And I personally when I'm talking to people and they ask me about fasting, I basically say that I don't think anybody over 60 should ever consider fasting. I think 36 hours is by far the longest, and I don't actually like to see people do any fasting more than a day. So I think there is inherently a muscle loss, and if you're over 60 and lose muscle, there's a very good chance you can never get it back.
Yeah, it's very challenging as we get older, for sure. But you were touching on earlier we talk about too is oxidative priority. So, right, you get the carbohydrates in the diet and the fat in the diet. Well, the carbohydrates just displace the fat from being burned. And the way I like to think of it is it's kind of in the reverse order of storage capacity, right? Your body's going to prioritize. You got all this fuel dumping into the blood. Just say you eat a meal that's got an alcoholic drink, some carbohydrates, protein, and fat. The alcohol, there's no place to store it, right? So the body has to burn that first with the priority. So most of the carbohydrates and fat get stored off. Carbohydrates, a little bit bigger storage capacity, but not nearly as big of storage capacity as fat, right? So fat becomes that sort of last priority because it's really easy for the body to store off the fat, and then it can deal with the other fuels.
Yeah, I think you've got it right. I'm a metabolism expert, so I'll go one step further. Glucose is incredibly toxic in the body. It's never allowed to stay. And when blood glucose gets too high, it's incredibly damaging. It'll damage your kidney, your eyes, your blood vessels. It actually has its own disease called diabetes, where blood lipids, over the long haul, if you continuously have them high and abnormal, they'll cause damage, but not acutely. Glucose is toxic in the moment, and so it will cause damage at every meal. So the body prioritizes how it gets rid of it. And to your point, we don't have the storage capacity, and frankly, we can't burn it. Back to that carbohydrate amount, we talked about the brain and red blood cells and how much they use, around 100 grams. The way we talk to people about carbohydrates is that for every gram of glucose carbohydrate you eat above 100 grams, you have to account for it by exercise. And exercise ranges from about 40 to 70 grams per hour. So we use the number of 60 per intense exercise. So if you go out and go to the gym and get your heart rate up to above 110 beats per minute for an hour, you got yourself another 60 grams of carbs. So you went now from 120 to 180. The average American's eating 300. So that means the average American needs 3 hours of intense exercise every day to account for the carbs they're eating, or they get all the metabolic problems you and I have been talking about. And that's exactly what we see.
And that proves the point you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet.
Well, it takes an awful lot of exercise to exercise your way out of it. There are very few average adults who have the time or the ambition to put in 3 hours of intense exercise. So unless you're an elite athlete or training for a marathon, most people don't get to that level. I mean, I play competitive tennis, and so my carbohydrate number is around probably 180 to 200 per day. But, I play an hour and a half of tennis virtually every day. And so I just simply don't feel good unless I get to that kind of level. But I'm accounting for it with my muscle activity.
Definitely. And I want to be respectful of your time, but I have one more quick point on the exercise piece, and it's something I've heard you mention about cardio. I think it was you need about 10 grams additional protein per hour of cardio. Is that correct?
So there was some early exercise, and again, Bob Wolf, I did some work with Bob Wolf, and we kind of looked at it. What we know is that during intense exercise, there is some increased oxidation of amino acids, particularly the branched-chain amino acid, leucine, valine, isoleucine. And that ends up being around 10 grams per hour of total protein. So you hear a lot of weightlifters say, well, I'm building muscle, so I need more protein. But then you see these marathoners who say, I'm not building muscle, so I don't need it. The reality is, technically, they actually need more. because they are actually burning it at a higher rate, at about 10 grams per hour, which we can demonstrate. So that whole metabolism has an interesting level of complication to it. It's called acute phase protein metabolism, and we could get into that. But basically, aerobic exercise does burn amino acids, particularly the branch chain. Branch chain to relate to how the body burns fatty acids. Leucine actually stimulates fatty acid burning. And so it all kind of interrelates to how the muscles generate energy. So it is there. There have been a few studies that showed that even supplementing branch chain amino acids during endurance exercise was beneficial. But that's kind of 50-50. About half of them show no effect. I personally don't believe it's a real benefit to do any yet, but there is an oxidation of amino acids during endurance exercise. And I don't mean walking, I mean running type of exercise.
Sure. Yeah, well, it's an important point because, if you're not doing strength training, you're doing more running, cardio. It's something you have to account for in your protein requirements. So that's important.
I think there's a reason that a lot of endurance athletes have very low upper body muscle look to them. Their body is basically depleting muscle. They're depleting amino acids out of their muscle to maintain their legs. I think that is a form of muscle starvation that's going on, because you have to get those proteins from those amino acids from somewhere, and basically they're sacrificing the upper body
because it's not moving as much as the lower body where
it needs. They don't really need it for the activity. So you're now seeing a lot of runners who are getting into more upper body strength training to sort of deal with that. Those. Great. To your point, there's definitely protein is important for all physical activity, and for somewhat different reasons.
Well, on that note, I think I'll let you go and respect your time. I'm so thankful that you came on. You were one of my mentors. I've looked at so much of your data and studies and information that has really helped us with our clients and prioritizing protein and doing the right things there. So I just want to thank you very much, Dr. Lehman, for coming on.
My pleasure. And, like I said, we're focused sort of on protein quality questions right now. We've got a paper that just came out, and we're going to have a couple more. So, as we have this sort of discussion about plant-based proteins, I think we need to be much more knowledgeable about what that means. And so, look for some of that. I think it's going to be useful data to people.
Yeah, you give me the links and the information, all your information. I'll put it all in the notes below.
Awesome. Thank you. My pleasure to join you.
Thank you.
If you want to change your life like I've changed mine with food, I would be honored to help you. Many of you don't know that I was twice my size. I had acid reflux. I had PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. I had depression. I had IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, and food changed my life. And not only did that happen, I get to eat good food, right? Good food. So if you want to eat good food, I have perfected meal plans made by me and personal help with supplements or modifications. If you have Hashimoto's, if you have Graves, if you have IBS, if you have PCOS, contact me. I would be honored to help you. You can go to keto-adapted.com and find a lot of different options there for personalized help, or message me by commenting below on this YouTube video, or you can check me out at mariamindbodyhealth.com. Mahalo.